Good evening, English 315 students. This is your professor, and this is going to be a short and sweet study of one of the three readings you're doing for this week, besides reading female poetry with the spleen and reading other poetry. You're going to be looking at, that is Cowper's poetry, you're going to be looking at Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. His kind of Americanized or westernized name is Gustavus Vasa. There's this notion of him being renamed by a master, and you can get these two identities in his work, both the African and the English slash American part. We're studying him, and it's kind of unique because he is an African slave, ostensibly, who came to the Americas as part of the British colonial trade, slave trade. And so the idea that we're studying him in a British literature class, I think, is kind of a very interesting thing. In the section of the Broadview anthology that he's in, there's the American poet Phyllis Wheatley, who visited England but had no real claims to England. She does write about England, and she saw herself as an English citizen. So if you can, start thinking about English literature from the 1700s in a more fluid way than an English citizen who was born there and lived there. Rather, that we're looking at it from the advent of British colonialism, the British slave trade, and of course Gustavus Vasa slash Olaudah Equiano lived in England the latter part of his life, and he was owned by Englishmen. So there's lots of reasons why we could consider this work pertinent for a British literature course. So I'm going to just mention a couple things and just tell you, if you read the prefatory note, you know that there's been scholarly work done, I think it was in the 90s, by a guy named Vincent Coretta. And he had basically researched Gustavus Vasa. The interesting narrative is a two-volume set published in 1789. And as we know, it was written for a white Christian audience. I teach this piece in American literature, and I often think, well, this is written for Americans to go against the slave trade, go against in favor of abolitionism. But when I read it in British literature, I could certainly see that he sees himself as a cosmopolitan kind of London figure, and someone who has no allegiance maybe to the United States or to England, certainly probably more so to England than anything else. But going back to Coretta, I mentioned that as a prefatory note. Coretta found something kind of odd in historical records on Olaudah Equiano. They found that he had a Navy muster roll, which is the roll you sign when you join the Navy, that said he was born in South Carolina. We also have his baptismal records that suggest he was born in South Carolina, which means that the entire two chapters you read for this week would be a fictionalized account that did not happen to him, if we believe those records. Those records, maybe he falsified them, maybe he just wrote it on his Navy muster roll. Maybe, there's lots of reasons to believe that those could be inauthentic. But if you're looking at my gestures, you could probably figure out that I kind of think that what we read for this week would be a fictionalized account of traditional slave literary tropes that he is then putting into a collective narrative as his own experience. He says he's from Nigeria, present-day Nigeria, the country of Asaka, and we see the entire middle passage, and it's a very stark portrayal of the middle passage, from Western Africa to Barbados, and then kind of in the Indies and all around there. If that's the case, the Coretta material would suggest that these are oral tales he was told as a slave in South Carolina, in different parts of the United States. These are probably oral stories he told. And one reason that I wonder whether this isn't a fictionalized account is that the early story with his sister, it's a very sentimental moment. He basically has this long harangue to her about staying virtuous while he's gone. And he basically says, the small relief of her presence surprised him I'm on 1732, sorry, surprised him as he was traveling through Africa. What are the chances of finding one's sister in the middle of Africa as one is traveling through unknown land? There's that, and there's also the early depiction when he's taken by slave traders who climb the fence and get into the village while the parents are away. I found a drawing of that from the 1800s, but it wasn't for Gustavus Vasa. It wasn't for Equiano. It was just a generalized study from, I think, a fictionalized novel. In other words, it would be the equivalent of at the end of every Hallmark movie, the woman gets the man and they get engaged, right? In the slave narratives, the children are taken by slave traders when the parents are away, and so that's a common literary trope. I could be mistaken. But at the same time, what we do know about Olaudah Equiano is that after the African part, he was bought and sold by various people, including Quaker, a British Quaker, including another British man, and he worked the Atlantic for quite some time in the shipping business. We can verify those events historically speaking, and we know that those events did happen to him. So, at least for the most part. So, it's the early part that Coretta's research has laid out for us. I'm going to mention maybe two more things and then call it a night. If you look in your book with me just for a moment, on page 1732, I want you to be aware that this is a genre called the slave narrative, and he's one of the earliest precursors, earliest publications that I know of in the field. Heck, he's one of the earliest pieces of written by African American, if we want to consider that rather than someone who's British from African origins, ever. As I mentioned, Phyllis Wheatley, her poetry comes right after this. And this is an odd use of English colonialism that I actually enjoy that the Broadview anthology has. But one of the things of the slave narrative is that the narrators, I'm thinking of Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs, 19th century slave narratives, often invokes an inanimate object and says, "You are freer than I am," or makes long-winded apostrophes. That is an extended address to an inanimate object, which he does here. His sister's gone, and he gives this apostrophe to her. "To that heaven which protects the weak and strong, I commit the care of your innocence and virtues. If they have not already been their full reward, and if their youth and delicacy have not since fallen victim to the violence of the African trader, the pestilential stench of a Guinea ship, the seasoning in the European colonies," sorry, lightning just happened, "or the lash and lust of a brutal, unrelenting overseer." Sorry, saw a flash of light, huge boom. Um, what I mean is he's giving this a direct address, apostrophizing her while she's not there, and it's almost like when you read Frederick Douglass, he addresses the fish underneath him and says, "You are freer than I," and Equiano does that. I can't decide whether to call him Vasa or Equiano. He's kind of both in some respects, the appropriate name and his supposedly real name. The only other thing I'd want to mention to you is on 1735 in your book, um, when he's on the ships, one of the things that he does is he mentions that the technology, the compass, the flying fish, even seeing a white person for the first time, it is such a shock to him that he almost plays into the notion that the technology is foreign and alien to him. These white writers talk about Native Americans like this, and he's someone from the African slave trade who's describing whiteness for the first time. He's describing seeing a technology he doesn't understand and ascribes magical attributes to. So there's this idea that I don't know whether he's playing into the stereotype, to be perfectly frank, or whether these are genuine moments of wonder and what the heck is a compass? What is a flying fish? And the liquors made me somewhat drunk. He mentions that they gave him liquor to wake him up. Certainly, there's an anti-alcohol or temperance element to that. But the only thing I'd want to mention is, historically speaking, this gives us a nice setup of if there is such an adjective for the middle passage, the horrific slave trade from across the Atlantic, from Africa to the Caribbean and to the United States and to South America. He describes this place as pestilential stenches, the shrieks of the women, groans of the dying, insupportable filth of the necessary tubs, that's human excrement. Children often fell and were often suffocated. So it's a horrific portrayal of it. If it didn't happen to him, it happened to someone. So maybe he sees himself as kind of speaking for the African race, and there's that. But its historical importance is there. Its use of rhetorical ideas we associate with the slave narrative is there, including the use of apostrophe. And it's an interesting narrative to be overall. If you were to continue reading, we only got the first two chapters. A lot of it is he becomes kind of this self-made man. He works for a particular master, gets granted a little bit more leeway than other slaves would, and he'll eventually get his freedom as well. So it's a powerful work, and if you get a chance to read the whole thing, good luck reading Anne Fitch's The Spleen, as well as reading um, William Cowper's two poems. I don't think those will take long. Have a great week. Bye.